Today I'm here at Fishbourne Roman Palace with Dr. Rob Symmons, the curator here. So Dr. Symmons, my idea is to bring classics more into the 21st century, make it accessible and streamline the facts so the wider public can access our ancient roots. So Fishbourne Roman Palace was built around 75 AD.
That's right, yep.
And this was only about 30 years after the Roman invasion in Britain. So this palace with over 100 rooms, with this luxurious bath suites and high-tech central heating, was greatly in contrast with the British round housing. That was quite basic really, with wood, thatched roofs. So do you think this would have been absolutely terrifying to the Britons to see this kind of technology and architecture just develop so rapidly around them?
I think that was the entire point of the building. It wasn't actually a particularly practical place to live. I mean, it was enormous. That's a lot of work to keep it standing.
Yeah.
It was not very well heated. There was some central heating or some underfloor heating, but it wasn't very effective. It would have been drafty. It wouldn't have been a really nice place to live. And you said sort of the roundhouses, the earlier roundhouses were basic. Yeah, they weren't quite as luxurious possibly to our minds,
Yeah.
but they were incredibly practical places to live. You could,
Exactly.
you could heat them, you could repair them when they started falling down. So any invading force who wanted to come to Britain wouldn't have built Fishbourne Roman Palace unless they wanted to impress people.
This was a statement,
it's
really,
absolutely
opposed
a
to their
statement.
practicality.
The building techniques, it was so very different from what existed before. The materials were different. Stone buildings were unheard of. Tiled roofs were unheard of. There was glass in the windows. That would have been nothing short of magical to the local population when they saw this kind of weird, kind of transparent stuff that looked like water, but it was hard. You know, that would have been.
Yeah. That's it, and I think it's very hard to imagine with these what seemingly incredibly modern concepts, what they would have just blown ancient minds, really, and possibly seemed, like you said, magical or kind of higher power and maybe very scary. This kind of sorcery that's just appearing around the Britons.
Absolutely, the Romans have arrived and they built this place within 30 years. In fact, they started a little bit earlier, but within 30 years, and that was them saying, "We're here, we're in charge."
Yeah.
And not only was it an architectural statement, even things like the throne room of the palace, the sort of audience chamber, was built on a higher level to the rest of the complex. So as the scruffy Celts were entering to come and meet the big head man who lived here, they come through the entrance hall, and it's a 40-foot construction. It's, you know, one of the biggest constructions alone that anybody would ever have seen.
So overwhelming.
Absolutely.
These structures, yeah.
They walk past massive statues. They get to the end of that entrance hall and they've got to walk past a fountain. You've never seen a fountain before.
Yeah.
What's that? You know, and this water squirting
Using
up.
water
Sorcery.
for like visual purposes rather than just practical necessities.
Yeah. And just the other side of the fountain, you've got the same thing again. You've got a formal garden. Before then, a garden was where you grew your veg.
Farmland, yeah.
Absolutely. But this is a garden with lawns and clipped hedges, and this is demonstrating access to resources that people would only have dreamed of. These Romans were saying, "No, we're not subsistence here. We've got access to extra stuff."
This is it, I think. Could we look back on the Romans and think, wow, they are so intelligent and just amazing that they came up with this? Or was it actually their abundance of wealth and access to the resources, logical applications, that they could build what they want, whereas these Britons just had not got the access to material?
I worry about that. I worry about the idea that a lot of people have, which is that because the Romans were able to do things a bit like what we do today, it meant they were advanced. If they were clever, they would have moved into roundhouses.
Yeah,
because then they wouldn't have been cold.
Yeah.
And they wouldn't have been spending loads of money. What they were doing was impressing people, and by that I mean making an impression.
Yeah.
And on the landscape. I mentioned the gardens. It's worth pointing out that before the Romans got here, in the Iron Age, certainly locally, we've got good archaeological evidence for the fact that the local population kind of revered the wilderness, the natural world. There was certainly no hunting. They weren't going out into the wilderness and bringing animals back to eat.
Yeah.
So there was a reverence for nature, and you know, this would have been, the wilderness would have been like where your ancestors went after they died. It would have been an almost a religious aspect to their lives. The Romans arrived. First thing they do, they create a formal garden, which just demonstrates control over nature.
Yeah.
So
like taming this wild land. Yeah.
It's like, you know where your ancestors go to die? Well, we own that now. It's a massive statement, not just the building, but everything they're doing here. They were importing animals, they were importing exotic animals. They set up what we think was some kind of early zoo.
Wow.
And nobody does that for fun.
Yeah.
They're doing that to prove.
That's it. And like this main idea, it's like what you said, this isn't for fun. It's almost masked as pleasure. Like, look what we can do with our spare time and our spare money. We can make these zoos. But actually, it's all very quite tactical moves, and it's demonstrating their power.
I'd say. Although that said, that's all against the big background of the fact that the person who we think lived at Fishbourne in the palace was a local tribal chief who was possibly educated in Rome, certainly known to the Romans. But I suspect the Romans were, as well as trying to impress the locals and dominate the locals, they were trying to impress this guy. His name was Tiberius Claudius Togidubnus, which is a horrible mouthful. So because they wanted him to do their bidding, and so they basically built him this big present.
They needed that kind of go-between between Britain and Rome. So,
and it's a big sort of blingy thing for him to waltz around in and feel good about himself.
Feel entitled.
Absolutely. So there's two sides of the coin.
Yeah.
And it's quite interesting that the archaeological evidence suggests that the building starts to deteriorate quite quickly. And it suggests that the Romans were clever, actually, because they're cynical, like me. They're a bit cynical. And they knew that they only needed Tiberius Claudius Togidubnus on their side for about 30 years while they consolidated their power in this country. And at that point, they could just cut him loose.
Yeah.
And it's no coincidence that the palace starts to fall down after about 30 years. And they didn't build this building for 1,000 years like the stuff they built in Rome.
Yeah, if they wanted it to last, it would have lasted.
Absolutely. And it's, you can see them cutting corners when you go around it. And it's still an amazing building, an amazing site. But you do kind of think they had an ulterior motive, as well as impressing the locals. It was to essentially bribe Togidubnus.
Yeah.
And once
appease him and make him do
their business. Use him. But then once it fulfilled that purpose, they didn't need the palace. So you get the sense they sort of withdrew their patronage, and literally by the middle of the 2nd century, parts of the building were just falling down.
Well, it's very, very tactical, and I think it's easy to say Romans were all about this grandeur and showing off maybe as part of it, but actually when you really look into it, it's so political. Everything that's statements or tactics to have allies or fight enemies, and I think it's very interesting.
Absolutely. The local tribe was, before even the Roman invasion, was friendly towards the Romans, and they were trading, and so they knew that if they had Togidubnus on side by building in this big palace, they could land troops here unopposed, and that would help the invasion as it came through towards the west. So it's all part of a big kind of big cynical jigsaw.
Well, we're standing here, we've come outside and we're standing here on a rather windy west wing, and you can see behind me part of our formal gardens, the first formal gardens ever laid out in Britain. But there's something particularly special about our gardens. But first I should explain something about the West Wing. The West Wing was built on a 5 foot high platform, 5 foot higher than the other three wings of the palace. And the reason for that is because this is where the throne room was, this is where the audience chamber was, and the idea was that anybody visiting the owner of the building would enter. They'd have to walk through these incredibly impressive formal gardens, and just as they got to the audience chamber, just where I'm standing, because it was elevated, they'd have to look up, and it was just a little sort of architectural trick just to remind any visitors who was in charge. Now, in order to get this 5-foot high platform, anybody else would have just built a platform. But no, not the Romans. The Romans decided the best thing to do would be to dig away the whole of the rest of the site. There was a reason they did this. They were trying to level the site at the same time. But in digging away the whole of the rest of the site behind me, they removed all of the topsoil. So when they came to plant their hedges, there was no topsoil. They had to dig little trenches in the patterns of the hedges they wanted to plant, fill those trenches with topsoil and plant into those. Then in the 1960s, when the archaeologists excavated the garden, they found those trenches full of topsoil. So those trenches, those features tell us exactly the shapes that the hedges were planted into. This isn't guesswork. These hedges are planted into exactly the same holes that the Romans dug 2,000 years ago, and you don't see that anywhere else in the world.
So something I'm really interested in is the use of central heating and underfloor heating here, and I think that just feels like such an incredibly modern concept. Could you possibly explain how it functioned and how it worked?
Yeah, okay. Well, the first thing is there was underfloor heating in the AD 75 building,
Yeah.
certainly in the bathhouse, we think, but also in our famous room with the cupola and the dolphin mosaic. But in that case, what they were actually doing was not heating that room, they were heating the two rooms next to each side of it.
Okay.
So essentially you've got the big dining room with the cupola and the dolphin, and the two adjacent rooms have got underfloor heating. So you're warming that, and it's creating like a hot air jacket for the room. A fabulously inefficient way to heat a dining room. So, but again, it makes you realise that this building wasn't a desperately practical.
Yeah.
You get the sense they just didn't think it through very well. But we're also famous for our hypocaust, which survives quite well. That's a much later addition. So this is when the about 82, 80. Now, the way they work, it's pretty straightforward actually. You have a furnace outside the building, ideally, not always, but in our case it is outside the building. And the hot air from the furnace goes down a sort of a tunnel, a tube, and there's a big void underneath the mosaic floor above, and it's also encased in tiles, in ceramic tiles. They're like paving slabs, actually.
Okay.
And all the hot air in that void gets heated up, and then the hot air disappears diagonally towards the corners of the rooms and is just vented up through chimneys, essentially, which are sort of hidden within the walls of the room above. So that hot air in that void is heating the room above.
Okay.
But it's also heating all the rubble and the soil and the masonry around the hypocaust, which slowly warms up, and the whole thing becomes like a storage heater.
Right.
So what you have to do is get all that rubble warm.
Yeah.
To do that, you need to actually feed the fire quite a lot, and you probably need to deforest a lot of West Sussex to get that nice and warm. But once it's ticking over, you don't need much wood at all.
Okay.
It's actually a very efficient way to heat the room above. Maybe I've done this experimentally at Butser Ancient Farm with some guys up there, and a log an hour is enough, depending on the size of the room. In fact, if you get it too warm, alarmingly, what happens is the floor and the walls pull apart, and then all the carbon monoxide that you're generating goes into the room above, and everybody dies.
Okay, so let's not do
warm.
that one.
Not too warm.
Not too warm.
But if you get it right, it's a very, very effective way of heating. And of course, you have no fumes in the room or anything like that.
Yeah.
So it is effective. But whether or not it's fair to say that it's a modern concept, I could take issue with, but that's a little bit of a hobby horse.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So some of the techniques here seem really innovative, and do you think that our modern Britain would be drastically different if we didn't have the Romans essentially bringing over these new ideas and ways of living?
That's really interesting. I mean, I think the short answer is no. I don't. The Romans lived in square buildings that were made of masonry, and they had tiled roofs.
Yeah.
They had a money economy, they had underfloor heating, they had glass in windows, all of this stuff. When they left, that all disappeared.
Really?
Largely, that all disappeared. And then had to be kind of reinvented later on. So I think it's hard to say that, didn't the Romans teach us so very much?
Yeah.
Because a lot of their technology disappeared.
Vanished, yeah.
And we got on with life perfectly adequately without them for hundreds of years.
Yeah. Maybe life would be simpler now if we
Absolutely.
didn't have a lot of that stuff.
You're absolutely right. I think there's a danger that people think that because the Romans were like us, they were advanced.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually quite a conceited way of thinking.
I can see that.
All you have to do is look at the Sutton Hoo treasure. And no Roman could ever have made that. That is so advanced. Or you could go back in time and look at the Paleolithic, where didn't have any of this Roman technology, but these guys could survive on the South Downs with no clothes and a piece of flint.
Yeah.
That's pretty advanced.
That's it. Maybe Romans overcomplicated things. And it's like what you were saying about the roundhouses. They were very practical and functional and worked. And yeah, maybe we've gone too far.
I just think that people look at them and think, oh, they're like us, they must be great.
Yeah, that's very true.
It does seem a bit conceited.
A bit of an ego boost for us.
Absolutely, we should just have a look at ourselves.
Yeah, that's it. Well, actually, this has happened quite a lot throughout history, where we've had knowledge and then it's disappeared, and we've rediscovered it. So essentially, this being here and these palaces and these techniques, it doesn't necessarily mean it impacted our modern world directly, because these techniques were thrown around and lost and recreated. So we don't necessarily rely on Romans to have modern day functionality.
No, I agree.
It's just that it's interesting to see that techniques, like we were saying, that we think we are so great and we have these, actually they had them, they weren't necessarily the best things, and they were just doing it, and maybe we need to get down off our high horse slightly.
I'd say just now, the Romans had their big square buildings with their tiled roofs, and those buildings would have been pretty drafty and pretty difficult to heat and maintain.
Yeah.
And I would say that the people that lived in the roundhouses with the open fires and the thatch roofs, they knew what they were doing.
Yeah,
they
probably lived quite a good life in their farming and providing for themselves. And
absolutely, yeah. I live in a roundhouse.
Yeah, simplicity, minimalism. So I've noticed that there's a lot of mosaics here and a lot of beautiful flooring.
But we're famous for them.
Yeah, I've noticed it personally. Yeah. So were these traditionally on the floor only? I'm assuming that the ones I can see all seem to be on the floor. There's no walls.
You can get wall mosaics, but not here at Fishbourne.
Okay. And do they vary in style a lot here, or are they mainly in a particular pattern, or are they all in similar colours?
It's pretty straightforward actually. There are two main styles here at Fishbourne. There are the black and white geometric floors, which are made from chalk and dollar stone, both from Dorset. The chalk obviously is white, the dollar stone is black, and they are very geometric in shape, and they all date to the AD 75. Almost all date to the AD 75 building of the palace, and they're the Fabian floors. Here at Fishbourne, they are generally of superb quality.
Yeah, there's some that are so intact and beautiful still. So
absolutely, yeah. And we're dealing here with almost certainly imperial craftsmen. The emperor has got his guys over to Fishbourne to lay these floors. Some of them are flawless, no pun intended. When you see a coloured figurative floor, so multicoloured floor, which has got kind of animals and people or whatever on it, and flowers. They're almost all later additions.
Okay.
So what happens is your black and white floor wears out, or you convert a bit of a courtyard into a room and you need to put a floor in. And at that point, the style, the trend has changed, and people are going for these more
so
figurative.
keeping up with the current trends.
Absolutely. But what's interesting is you can see the quality's dipped by this
Really?
stage. So at this stage, the emperor has probably started to withdraw his patronage.
Yeah.
Or his support.
Done what he needs now.
Yeah,
he's got
that's
what
right.
he needs.
He's got what he needs, and it's like bye. And still, some of them are great. Some not so good at all, and they do look like they're just people having a go. But anybody with any kind of mosaic floor is still in the top echelons of society. But it's quite interesting that you can see that slight decline in quality.
Yeah, and it just shows the control that the Romans could either give a bit more or take it away, and it just so reflective here of how invested they were.
Absolutely. Same thing happens today in modern society, I'm sure.
Exactly. Yeah. So so stylistically, what kind of images would be shown? You said there was a few, the later ones were with some animals and people. Do you think that these were scenes from myths generally?
Mythological. We're all thinking of Cupid and the dolphin, aren't we? Which
Obviously, elephant in the room.
that old one. Yes, and they're obviously Cupid and the dolphin is mythological, and then you've got mythological beasts as well. I've thought a lot about the sort of designs and design features of the floors, and sometimes I just can't help but think, because people ascribe an awful lot of meaning to, or we've got this myth is being portrayed in this floor, and so what does that tell us about the owner? And I can't help but thinking, sometimes, did they care?
Are you reading too much into it, kind of thing?
And sometimes you look at the floors and you can see really, some of the, certainly our later floors, really quite obvious errors, which hadn't been corrected when the floor was laid, and you think, why didn't you correct that?
Yeah, just carelessness? Or?
Was it, had you run out of money or whatever? Yeah. But then I heard somebody a while ago say, well, did they just not care?
Yeah, it wasn't important.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. It is the floor after all.
Yeah.
And the fact is, you've got a mosaic, end of story.
If it's pretty good, it's pretty good.
Yeah,
if it's
you're still above 99% of the rest of the population.
Yeah, true.
But did people actually sit and study these floors?
Yeah. Was it better to just have a bit of mosaic to show your status and wealth than actually, let's not waste the money refining it, because you've got it. You've got the tiles. You don't need anything more, really.
Absolutely. You've got the sports car. Do you really need the ceramic brakes?
Yeah. Good comparison. Yeah. Like I said at the start, I essentially just want to make the ancient world more mainstream and make it accessible. I think a lot of the time classical civilization as a subject even is just kind of dying out when choosing GCSEs or A-levels even. So why do you think it should be brought into the modern day, or what do you think people should really take away and know from the ancient world? If they only know like one thing maybe, what do you think people should relate the modern world to the ancient world?
Okay, that's complicated.
Quite a loaded question.
We do live with this stuff all the time. Yeah, we Cupid. We've got a Cupid here. Cupid features in our everyday lives. That kind of thing. But I think when it comes to learning about the ancient world, knowing the facts is kind of important. Knowing what happened in the past, the histories, the written histories, the classical texts. But I think also what's really important is being able to interpret the evidence that we've got. And I'm not so much talking about the histories here. I'm trained as an archaeologist, and so the archaeological evidence, and being able to understand how we get from all of these boxes full of artifacts to a story about Fishbourne Roman Palace and what happened there and who lived there and what they ate and what they did in the mornings and how they got about and what they wore, all that kind of business. So for me, what's important is the mental skills of being able to look at evidence, understand it, and then interpret it in a sensible way. For me personally, knowing that ex-emperor died in a particularly horrible way on a particular date is of no interest whatsoever.
Yeah.
I'm much more interested in the guy who cut the grass in the formal garden.
Yeah.
What kept him awake at night? How did he sharpen his scythe?
Yeah.
That kind of thing. It's the day to day.
Exactly, because I think this is maybe what's important to know, because it's what's relatable and it's easy to maybe apply it more. So I think often it's perhaps easier to get lost and kind of zone out when it's all these dates and figures and political events. But actually, when you break it down and you think, if I was there and working, and what did they do? What did they eat for breakfast and then go out? And this was their life. And you think about people as ancient people as real people, essentially, because I think it's easy to either put them on a pedestal or just make them kind of a separated civilization that's no relevancy to today. But actually, they were living their life like we are right now.
And we're ordinary people. I'm an ordinary person.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in ordinary people.
That's it. I think that's probably what would help a lot more people to become interested, is finding something that you can relate to. Because I think a lot of classics, especially when you're starting out, you need this kind of overview of political events, and that means you're focusing on emperors and wealthy senators and people like this. But actually, it's very hard to lose. It's very easy to lose sight.
Yeah. All of that stuff's important. That gives you the framework.
Yeah.
But I think, if you want to understand 21st century society, you don't go and talk to politicians and pop stars and sportsmen. You talk to the people in Chichester doing their shopping.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. Okay, thank you so much for today. That's been really enlightening and really lovely to actually discuss why because I think classics really needs to be brought back into this modern world. So I think that was a lovely chat to have.
It's been fun.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for all the information and your very insightful views as well.
Bless you, thank you.
Fishbourne Roman Palace is a brilliant example of how the ancient world is kept alive in the modern day. I'd like to thank Dr. Rob Symmons for all his help and all the staff here at Fishbourne for an interesting and insightful day. And I urge anyone who has not been here to take a visit.